Well, CBS News Elections Director Anthony Salvanto has been breaking down some new data for us, and he joins us right now. And Anthony, you know, it's all well and good to have an interesting performance, but you have to be speaking to the voters. It needs to translate into actual voter support. And you've been looking at the issues that the Republican voters are really interested in.
Right, because that's how a pollster will approach this.
Right.
You know, the pundits will say somebody won, somebody lost. It can be subjective, though it can be smart.
Yeah.
But when a pollster looks at this, we ask, what kind of voter groups are they reaching out to? Who might they match up with, right? You saw in that package, which was fantastic, by the way, you know, you saw Donald Trump say, build a wall, right? So let's start with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Obviously, he made a lot of waves with his comments on immigration. This is something that divides Republicans, you know.
Can we listen to Donald Trump right here?
Okay.
Mr. Trump, it has not escaped anybody's notice that you say that the Mexican government is sending criminals, rapists, drug dealers across the border. Governor Bush has called those remarks, quote, extraordinarily ugly. I'd like you're right next to him, talk to him directly and say how you respond to that. And you have repeatedly said that you have evidence that the Mexican government is doing this, but that you have evidence you have refused or declined to share. Why not use this first Republican presidential debate to share your proof with the American people?
So, if it weren't for me, you wouldn't even be talking about illegal immigration, Chris. You wouldn't even be talking about it. This was not a subject that was on anybody's mind until I brought it up at my announcement, and I said, Mexico is sending. Except the reporters, because they're a very dishonest lot, generally speaking, in the world of politics, they didn't cover my statement the way I said it. The fact is, since then, many killings, murders, crime, drugs pouring across the border, our money going out and the drugs coming in. And I said, we need to build a wall, and it has to be built quickly. And I don't mind having a big, beautiful door in that wall so that people can come into this country legally. But we need, Jeb, to build a wall. We need to keep illegals out.
All right, there he is. And he's sort of been accused of being divisive with some of his language when it comes to immigration. But what do Republican voters think?
Well, you get 46% in the latest poll who say that illegal immigrants should have some kind of path to citizenship. So it's no coincidence there that it's Trump against Bush, because they have somewhat different views on this, right? And then another sizable 4 in 10 Republicans favor some form of policy that gets those illegal immigrants somehow to leave the country.
Right.
Okay. So that divide is present within the Republican Party, and it would not surprise me going forward if then the voter groups who might support Bush or might support Trump also are clearly divided on that. So that's one of the, frankly, very few policy splits that we see so prominently now.
Very interesting. You know, one of the things that people have talked about when trying to analyze the popularity of Trump is that he's not a politician. He's a businessman, and he doesn't speak political speak. He speaks straight talk, and maybe it's sort of a reaction to people just being fed up with what's happening in Washington.
He leads among the voters who come out and say that they are angry. He leads by a double-digit margin among those voters. And it's a sizable percentage of Republicans who do. Now, some of that is just partisanship. You can be angry because you're not getting what you want. You can be angry because you're not in the White House at the moment. But some of it is staunch conservatives who feel like the party hasn't been fighting enough. They're Republicans, but they want an even stronger stance. And so some of that rhetoric that's coming from Trump, very clearly the voters are telling us, is attracting them to him. And that's why I think you saw him try to keep it up last night.
So let's talk a little bit about Jeb Bush. He was almost overshadowed because everyone was so focused on Trump. But, you know, here's Jeb Bush. He's trying to differentiate himself from his brother. And you know, one of the key issues has to be the Iraq War. And can we listen a little bit to what he had to say about the Iraq War?
Knowing what we know now, with faulty intelligence and not having security be the first priority when we invaded, it was a mistake. I wouldn't have gone in. However, for the people that did lose their lives and the families that suffered because of it, I know this full well, because as governor of the state of Florida, I called every one of them every one of them that I could find, to tell them that I was praying for them, that I cared about them, and it was really hard to do. And every one of them said that their child did not die in vain, or their wife or husband did not die in vain. And so why it was difficult for me to do it was based on that. Here's the lesson that we should take from this, which relates to this whole subject. Barack Obama became president, and he abandoned Iraq. He left, and when he left, Al-Qaeda was done for. ISIS was created because of the void that we left. And that void now exists as a caliphate the size of Indiana. To honor the people that died, we need to stop the Iran agreement for sure, because the Iranian mullahs have their blood on their hands, and we need to take out ISIS with every tool at our disposal.
All right, so there you go. What to do with ISIS?
Well, 60% of Republicans favor using ground troops to combat ISIS.
60%.
Okay.
Wow.
But when former Governor Bush talks about the Iraq War, this is an important point for him, because even among Republicans, views of whether the war was worth it declined over time. They were very high, or even as late as 2006, but then slowly, by the time Republicans were looking back on it by 2014, it was only about a quarter of Republicans who said so. So there is a constituency within the Republican Party that still was and is skeptical of that war.
Right.
Plus, he also has a certain segment who will be skeptical of how different will you be than your brother. And to the point of saying, well, the war was a mistake, that's a difference that he can start to draw, maybe trying over time to allay some of those concerns that, especially if he gets to the general, if he becomes the nominee, how are you different from former President Bush?
And he's certainly been challenged in the past figuring out how to craft that answer, and it seems like he figured something out, at least for this debate, but he's been criticized before for sort of not being clear about that.
It's not just him. In some sense, all the candidates have to walk that, because Republicans do favor a strong military approach to terrorism, but after the results, what they saw of an Iraq war that went awry, and there's a little bit of nervousness there about what might happen if there's more boots on the ground.
Yeah. Okay, next topic has to be campaign finance. Of course, you have Donald Trump, self-proclaimed billionaire, walking into the race, but also the Koch brothers, who have said whoever they decide to back, they're going to pump almost $900 million into that person's campaign. How do Republicans feel about that?
The same way most Americans do, which is that it's not so much the dollar amount that's spent. There are a lot of things in America that cost a lot of money. We don't necessarily begrudge that, but it's the exclusivity that it brings. And what they feel is that politics should be the province of everybody, that everybody should have a say. And yet you poll and you find that more than 8 in 10 Americans think that there's too much money in politics. What they're saying is, I don't have access. And that's why it's clear that Donald Trump does strike a chord when he says, I'm self-funded, therefore I'm not going around and with my hand out to other donors. And, of course, the flip side to that is, well, then, can only rich people run for president? And what does that do to close it off, too? So it's about access as much as it is cost.
Yeah. Another hot button topic has to be same-sex marriage.
Right. This to some degree divides Republicans. You do have a majority, a slim majority of Republicans who do not support it. And it's very clear that many of the candidates on that stage are going to be in sync with that constituency. I also noticed that John Kasich, who said, he made a very, very clear point that he would support people who were his friends and family in that regard, and attended a same-sex wedding. We can probably play that clip.
Yeah, I was going to say, Anthony, let's listen to that.
Well, look, I'm an old-fashioned person here, and I happen to believe in traditional marriage. But I've also said the court has ruled.
But how would you explain to your child?
Megan, the court has ruled, and I said we'll accept it. And guess what? I just went to a wedding of a friend of mine who happens to be gay. Because somebody doesn't think the way I do, doesn't mean that I can't care about them or I can't love them. So if one of my daughters happened to be that, of course I would love them and I would accept them, because you know what? That's what we're taught when we have strong faith.
All right, there you go. And he received a lot of applause.
This is important for a couple of reasons. One is that younger voters do not vote for Republican in the same number as they vote Democrat. And one big reason is that they feel the party is out of step with the mainstream on same-sex marriage. So would it be a majority of the Republicans who might go to him because of that? Maybe not. But a segment will. A younger segment might, if that's an important issue. And in a fractured field, that could be enough. That could be a big deal.
Anthony, all very interesting. Anthony Salvanto, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.